It was late in Moscow, March 23, 1983. The air in the Kremlin was thick with the day's stale cigarette smoke and the low, constant hum of secure teletype machines. General Secretary Yuri Andropov, a man whose entire life had been a study in suspicion, was dying. His kidneys were failing, but his mind, steeped in the cold logic of the KGB, which he had run for 15 years, remained sharp, analytical, and profoundly paranoid. He was already consumed by a deep-seated fear, a secret dread known within the darkest corners of the Soviet state as Operation Ryan. This was the KGB's codename for their standing analysis of a raketno-yadernoy napadenie, a nuclear missile attack. Andropov, unlike the blustering Brezhnev before him, genuinely believed the new American president, Ronald Reagan, was unhinged enough to launch a surprise first strike. He saw preparations for it everywhere. He had ordered every residentura, every KGB station from Washington to Bonn, to hunt for phantom signs of this impending nuclear holocaust. His agents were checking the blood bank levels near American military bases and monitoring church services for the families of servicemen. This was the suffocating atmosphere of terror inside the Soviet leadership. Into this furnace of dread, a single spark fell. It wasn't a missile. It wasn't a scrambled interceptor. It was a piece of paper, a flash bulletin from the TASS news agency's Washington bureau, landing with a soft, insignificant thud on a cluttered desk. An aide, his face pale, hand-delivered the translated transcript to the General Secretary's inner circle. They read it. Then they read it again. The words made no sense. It was a speech, a public address to the American people, but the content was impossible. It was a perversion of reality. The American president had, in a single televised moment, declared his intention to break the one holy, unspoken rule of the Cold War. He hadn't announced a new bomber. He hadn't unveiled a new submarine. He had announced a dream, a fantasy. He had spoken of a future where strategic ballistic missiles, the very bedrock of Soviet power, the mailed fist that guaranteed their seat at the table, would be rendered impotent and obsolete. He had proposed a shield. In a sterile, fluorescent-lit room deep within the Ministry of Defense on Arbat Square, the assembled generals and marshals of the Soviet Union could only stare. A shield? What did that mean? Like a medieval castle wall? Against a Topol M ICBM traveling at 17,000 miles per hour? It was absurd. It was the ramblings of a Grade B actor, as Foreign Minister Gromyko had famously sneered. The initial reaction was not fear. It was confusion, bordering on contemptuous disbelief. Is he senile? One general might have muttered. A bluff, another would have insisted, slamming his hand on the table. A transparent psychological trick. He's trying to spook us. Or, a third, quieter voice from the GRU main intelligence directorate would add, it's a lie. A cover story. This shield is a cover for a new weapon, a space-based system designed to strike us from orbit. This was the first layer of the mystery. The speech was a phantom. It described a technology that did not exist. It violated the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, a document the Soviets regarded as sacred, not out of a love for peace, but because it codified the balance of terror. The ABM Treaty was the rule that said, neither of us will build a shield, which implicitly meant we both agree to remain vulnerable to each other. This vulnerability was the key. It was the great equalizer. It was mutually assured destruction. Mad, a stable, horrifying, and most importantly predictable state of affairs. Reagan had just proposed to end it. The immediate scramble was not military, it was intellectual. Phones rang at the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Academicians, men who had devoted their lives to theoretical physics and advanced rocketry, were pulled from their beds. The Strategic Defense Initiative, they were asked. What is it? They looked at the proposals. Lasers, particle beams, X-ray weapons powered by nuclear explosions in space, kinetic energy hunter-killer satellites. Their answer was swift and nearly unanimous. This is science fiction. Zvezdnie Voyny, Star Wars. The nickname was born of derision. This was the stuff of fantasy, of Hollywood, not of serious military science. To create a functioning, comprehensive shield was, in their expert opinion, a problem of such staggering complexity that it bordered on the impossible. The computing power required alone was beyond anything in existence. The power generation, the targeting, the sheer number of leaks that would get through, It was a fool's errand. This was the report they sent back to the Kremlin. And this is where the true terror began to set in. Andropov, the spy master, looked at their report, and he looked at the speech. His entire life's experience told him one thing. People do not lie so grandly without a purpose. The report from his scientists said, it's impossible. The transcript from Washington said, we are going to do it. A new, terrifying possibility began to form in the shadows of the Kremlin, a possibility that combined their two deepest fears, American technical superiority and American irrationality. What if the scientists were wrong? What if the Americans, with their Silicon Valley computers and their endless budgets, had achieved a breakthrough? A silent, secret revolution in physics that the KGB had somehow missed. What if this Star Wars program wasn't a proposal for the next century, but a euphemism for a weapon they were deploying now? The Soviet Union's entire military-industrial complex was built on imitation. They stole the plans for the atomic bomb. They stole the plans for the Concorde to build their Concordsky. They copied the B-29 bomber bolt for bolt to create their 2-4. Their system was built to react. It was a magnificent machine for copying, but a poor one for true invention. And now, America had proposed a race into a field the Soviets didn't even understand. This was the impossible event, not a blip on a radar, but an idea that threatened to rewrite the laws of physics and, with them, the global balance of power. The Soviets were baffled, not by a machine, but by the sheer terrifying scale of the American imagination. We are Cold War impact. And if you want to understand how these vast, secret conflicts shape the world we live in, subscribe to the channel and join our investigation. The stakes were not just military, they were existential. The entire edifice of Soviet power, its status as a superpower, rested on a single terrible promise. If you attack us, we will annihilate you. Their economy was crumbling. Their ideology was a hollow shell. Their social fabric was rotting with alcoholism and cynicism. The only thing that made them equal to the West was their nuclear arsenal. Their thousands of SS-18 Satan missiles, buried in hardened silos across the frozen taiga, were the great guarantor. They were the one thing that made the world listen. Reagan's proposal threatened to turn that entire arsenal into the world's most expensive pile of scrap metal. If America could build a shield, it meant America could launch a first strike with total impunity. They could fire their own missiles, knowing the Soviet response would simply bounce off. The shield wasn't a defensive weapon. It was the ultimate offensive enabler. It was a checkmate. It meant the end of the Soviet Union. And so, the greatest intelligence operation in Soviet history began. The mystery had to be solved, and solved immediately. The order went out from the 12th Department of the KGB and from the highest echelons of the GRU. The mission was simple, and it was absolute. Find out what the Americans really know. Find out if Star Wars is a bluff, a dream, or a dagger pointed at the heart of the motherland. Find Line X. The hunt was on. But they weren't hunting for a submarine or a plane. They were hunting for a ghost, a phantom of laser beams and particle accelerators that existed, for now, only in the mind of the American president. And they were terrified of what they would find. The order from Moscow was absolute. The full weight of the Soviet intelligence apparatus, the largest and most pervasive spy network the world had ever seen, was retasked. The mission: solve the mystery of SDI. This wasn't a standard military problem. It was a scientific inquisition. The KGB's first chief directorate, the state's foreign intelligence arm, went to war. Its Line R officers, responsible for operational planning, and its Line T officers, the technology thieves, fanned out across the West with a new, desperate shopping list. They weren't just after blueprints for a new jet engine. They were after the fundamental theories of the 21st century. Every Soviet agent, from the deep-cover illegal posing as a Canadian businessman to the consular attaché with diplomatic immunity, was activated. Their targets were no longer just politicians and generals. They were graduate students at MIT. They were disgruntled engineers at Lockheed, TRW and McDonnell Douglas. They were obscure physicists publishing papers on high-energy lasers and magnetic field generation. The GRU, military intelligence, activated its own vast network. Spetsnaz units trained for sabotage, but its agents were now tasked with something far more subtle. They needed to know what was being built in the American deserts. What were those strange new facilities at White Sands, Lawrence Livermore, and the sprawling complex at Area 51. The initial reports that trickled back to the center in Moscow were a cascade of pure, unfiltered noise. One agent, monitoring signals from a US Air Force tracking station, reported a massive surge in encrypted satellite data. What were they launching? A GRU source inside a West German aerospace firm reported a sudden, inexplicable demand for new, lightweight composite materials capable of withstanding extreme temperatures. For what? Atmospheric re-entry? Or laser shielding? A Line T operative, in a high-risk operation, managed to acquire the research abstract from a low-level physicist at Caltech. It spoke of neutral particle beams and their potential for energy transmission. To the analysts in the sterile, windowless rooms of the Yasunivo intelligence complex, this was a nightmare. Each piece of data was a puzzle, but the pieces didn't fit together. They formed no coherent picture. They had reports of massive, ground-based chemical lasers. They had rumors of X-ray lasers in orbit, powered by nuclear explosions, a project code named Excalibur. They had whispers of brilliant pebbles, a swarm of thousands, or even millions, of tiny, independent, kinetic kill satellites that would form a cloud of shrapnel in space, waiting to hurl themselves into the path of a Soviet warhead. This deluge of conflicting information did something far worse than reveal the truth. It fed the paranoia. The mystery of SDI became a bogeyman, a shape-shifting monster that lived in the shadows of the Soviet military mind. Every failure, every accident, was now re-examined. When a test of their own new SS-24 missile failed, was it a simple engineering fault? Or, a paranoid general would ask in a closed-door meeting, had an American prototype weapon interfered with it from space? When a Cosmos navigation satellite suddenly lost contact over the Pacific, was it a solar flare? Or was it shot down by a silent, invisible laser, a test of the very shield they were hunting? The legend of SDI grew. It became an all-encompassing invisible force. Soviet pilots on patrol near the Bering Strait reported strange radar ghosts, impossible returns that would appear and vanish. Was it atmospheric interference? Or an American platform testing a new stealth shield? The Soviet military-industrial complex, a vast, hungry beast, seized on the panic. They saw a threat, but they also saw an opportunity. Marshals and defense ministers, their chests heavy with medals, marched into the Politburo and demanded billions of rubles for a response. But how do you respond to a phantom? This paralysis led them to a series of disastrous, wildly incorrect conclusions. The Kremlin, the Academy of Sciences, and the KGB were torn apart by three competing and equally terrifying theories. The first and most common was the Great Lie. This theory held that SDI was a massive, brilliant, and diabolical bluff. It was a cover story. The Americans, they reasoned, were not building a shield. They were building a sword. The defensive technology, the lasers, the particle beams, was actually a cover for a new generation of offensive space weapons designed to decapitate the Soviet Union in a single, unblockable first strike from orbit. They weren't trying to stop missiles after launch. They were trying to destroy the silos before launch. In response, the Soviets poured billions into hardening their silos, burying their command centers deeper, and developing new, fast-launching mobile ICBMs. They were building a defense against a weapon that didn't exist. The second theory was the secret breakthrough. This was the nightmare scenario, the one Andropov had feared from the beginning. This theory held that the Americans were not bluffing, that they had achieved a revolutionary non-linear breakthrough in physics, that a Manhattan project for lasers had already succeeded, in secret. This sent Soviet science on a frantic, ruinous chase. They funded their own asymmetrical response, pouring resources into theoretical, often bizarre, counter-programs. They too tried to build particle beam weapons. They tried to build ground-based lasers to blind American satellites. They wasted a decade and a fortune chasing scientific dead ends, trying to catch up in a race where the other runner hadn't even left the starting blocks. The third, and most insidious theory, was economic warfare. A few, cynical, and ultimately correct analysts, primarily in the foreign ministry, proposed the most terrifying idea of all. They argued that the Americans knew the technology was impossible. They knew it couldn't work. The entire program, they whispered, was a psychological trap. It was a poison pill, designed to exploit the Soviet Union's greatest weakness, its crippling, paranoid need to imitate. The Americans knew that the Soviet system, by its very nature, had to respond. It had to build its own Star Wars. And they knew with cold, calculating certainty that the economic strain of doing so would be the final, fatal blow. They were forcing the USSR to commit suicide, to bankrupt itself chasing a phantom. Torn between these three conclusions, the Soviet state did the only thing it could. It tried to fight all three phantoms at once. They spent billions hiding their missiles from a non-existent space weapon. They spent billions chasing a scientific breakthrough that had not happened. And in doing so, they fell headfirst into the economic trap that would, in less than a decade, bleed their empire dry. The investigation had failed. They had gathered a mountain of data, but had found no truth. They were more confused, more paranoid, and more terrified than when they began. They were now fighting a shadow, and the shadow was winning. While the Kremlin's intelligence agencies hunted ghosts in the static and paranoia, the truth of the Strategic Defense Initiative was unfolding not in a single, secret-filled bunker, but in plain sight across the sprawling, optimistic, and incredibly well-funded landscape of the American military-industrial and scientific complex. The source of the mystery wasn't a hidden weapon. It was a question posed by the most powerful man in the world who had simply decided to change the rules of the game. The shift in perspective lands not in a lab, but in the Oval Office, years earlier. Ronald Reagan. To the Soviets, he was an irrational cowboy, a dangerous warmonger. But in this, they fundamentally misunderstood him. He was, at his core, a moralist. And he possessed a deep, visceral, and almost personal hatred for the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. He was appalled by it. He couldn't understand a strategy that relied on the passive threat of total annihilation. "We're hostages to each other," he'd famously complained. He didn't want to avenge a nuclear strike. He wanted to prevent it. He wanted, as he would later say, to make nuclear weapons obsolete. On a tour of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, in 1979, before his presidency, he had been walked through the chilling process. He asked the general in charge, "What happens if a missile is launched?" The general explained the process of detection, the red phone call, the 5 minutes the president would have to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike that would kill 150 million people. Reagan was shaken. He asked, "What can we do to stop the missile?" The general's answer was the answer of the entire Cold War establishment. "Nothing, sir. We can only avenge." That answer was, to Reagan, morally and intellectually unacceptable. And when he became president, he decided to change it. The impossible event of his March 1983 speech wasn't born from a finished blueprint passed to him by the Pentagon. It was born from this conviction, and from a series of meetings with a man who did believe it was possible, Edward Teller. Teller, the brilliant, controversial, and implacable father of the H-bomb, was a force of nature. A Hungarian émigré who, like Reagan, viscerally distrusted the Soviet Union, Teller was the high priest of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California. He and his young protégés were not bound by the it-can't-be-done dogma of the East Coast scientific establishment. They were California dreamers, armed with supercomputers and a culture of radical invention. In 1982, Teller had visited Reagan. He brought him the good news. He told him that a new generation of physics, of technology, was emerging. That the offense-dominated world of the ICBM was not a permanent law of nature. A defense, he argued, was possible. This was the spark. Reagan, the optimist, seized it. He didn't ask, "Is it proven?" He asked, "How do we start?" The Strategic Defense Initiative, therefore, wasn't a project. It was a crusade. It was an umbrella, a blank check, a national mobilization. While the Soviets were trying to find the one secret weapon, the Americans were funding 100 different, competing, and often contradictory ideas. This was the American solution. It wasn't a single, focused arrow. It was a shotgun blast of technological ingenuity. The Soviets were baffled by the scale because the scale was, in fact, the entire point. In the New Mexico desert, at the White Sands Missile Range, engineers were testing Miracle, the mid-infrared advanced chemical laser. It was a monster, a device the size of a building that used the hypergolic reaction of rocket fuel to generate a continuous, multi-megawatt laser beam. In tests, it had successfully destroyed the booster stage of a static Titan missile. It was a ground-based behemoth, a brute force solution. At the same time, in the secure labs at Livermore, Teller's kids, a group of young physicists in their 20s and 30s, were working on something that sounded like pure science fiction, Project Excalibur. The concept was breathtakingly audacious. A small grapefruit-sized nuclear bomb would be placed at the center of a spool of long metallic glass rods. When the bomb detonated in space, it would vaporize the rods, focusing the immense X-ray energy of the blast into dozens of coherent, independent, and lethally powerful laser beams, each capable of destroying a missile thousands of miles away. It was a disposable, one-shot X-ray laser, a battle station that consumed itself in a nuclear fireball to kill its enemies. This was the secret breakthrough the Soviets were terrified of, and the Americans were, in fact, testing it. In the Nevada desert, in underground shafts, they were detonating nuclear devices to see if the physics of an X-ray laser even worked. The results were ambiguous, classified, and to the Soviets, who only heard the rumors, terrifying. But that was just one track. Another, completely different philosophy was emerging from other think tanks. Why build a few, complex, Death Star battle stations that could be targeted and destroyed? Why not build millions of tiny, simple and smart ones? This was brilliant pebbles. The idea was to deploy a cloud of small, self-guided interceptors into low Earth orbit. Each pebble would be a marvel of American miniaturization, a kinetic kill vehicle with its own small rocket motor, sensors, and a simple computer no bigger than a bread box. They would float silently in space until a Soviet launch was detected. Then, thousands of them would wake up, find their targets, and simply crash into them. A pebble traveling at orbital velocity, 17,000 miles per hour, would strike a warhead with the kinetic energy of a locomotive. No explosive needed. It was a high-tech cloud of shrapnel, a purely digital distributed defense. This was the American ingenuity. The Soviets, with their centralized top-down economy, would pick one path and follow it. The Americans, with their culture of venture capital and creative competition, would fund all of them. They funded directed energy weapons, lasers, particle beams. They funded kinetic energy weapons, brilliant pebbles, railguns. They funded the battle management computers and software, a program that, by itself, was more complex than anything ever attempted, requiring tens of millions of lines of code that had to work perfectly the first time. This was the American dominance. It wasn't just in having the money, though they were spending billions. It was in having the intellectual ecosystem to pursue so many radical parallel paths at once. It was the fusion of California's what-if, optimism, Silicon Valley's computing boom, and the blank check budgets of the Pentagon. The Soviets were looking for a weapon. The Americans were building an industry dedicated to dreaming up the impossible, and the Kremlin's worst fear that they had missed a secret breakthrough was both true and false. There was no single breakthrough. The breakthrough was the system itself, the sheer, audacious and baffling scale of the effort. They were facing an enemy that had decided to weaponize imagination. The Soviet hunt for the truth of SDI went on for years, a grinding, expensive, and paranoid obsession. They sifted through mountains of conflicting data, chasing phantoms in their own scientific institutes and in the deserts of the American West. The mystery was a suffocating fog. And then, in a single, devastating moment, the fog cleared. The confrontation didn't happen in a committee room or on a battlefield. It happened with the thud of a briefcase on a desk. The date was October 2nd, 1985. Adolf Tolkachev, an electronics engineer at the Phasotron Scientific Research Institute in Moscow, the USSR's lead developer of military radar, was one of the CIA's most valuable assets in history. He was Agent Goldfinch. For years, he had been passing Moscow's most sensitive avionics and radar secrets to his American handlers in dead drops across the city. His motives were not money. They were a deep, burning hatred for the Soviet system. In one of his final deliveries before his eventual capture, Tolkachev passed along a document that was more explosive than any blueprint. It was an internal, top-secret report from his institute, written for the highest levels of the Politburo. The subject, an analysis of the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was not a Western analysis. This was the Soviet Union's own best and brightest, their top weapons scientists, giving their unvarnished, terrified opinion to their masters. When the report reached Langley, and then the White House, it was a revelation. It was the shock moment, but in reverse. The Americans suddenly and clearly understood the profound, paralyzing terror their program had induced. The Tolkachev report laid it bare. The Soviet scientists, the report stated, had concluded that the USSR could not compete. They stated, in cold analytical prose, that any asymmetrical or symmetrical response was doomed. They didn't have the computing power, they didn't have the microelectronics, they didn't have the advanced manufacturing. They simply could not build their own SDI. And worse, they had calculated the cost of countering it, of building a new generation of invulnerable ICBMs with fast-burn boosters, stealthy warheads, and massive fields of decoys. The cost, they concluded, was so astronomically high that it would destroy the Soviet economy. This was the truth. This was the horrifying reveal. The true weapon of SDI was not a laser. It was not a particle beam. The weapon was economics. The program was a gun pointed not at their missiles, but at their treasury. The Americans were right about the economic trap, even if they hadn't intended it as the primary goal. This intelligence, combined with other high-level defectors' reports, painted a clear picture. The Soviets were not just confused, they were beaten, and they knew it. The shock rippled backward. When General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev met with President Reagan in Reykjavik in 1986, he had one all-consuming goal: to kill SDI. He offered staggering concessions. He offered to eliminate entire classes of nuclear weapons, to pull back from Europe, to essentially end the arms race, if Reagan would agree to confine SDI to the laboratory. The world watched, stunned, as Gorbachev, the great reformer, practically begged. To the public, it looked like a negotiation. To the inner circles of the Kremlin, it was a desperate plea for a lifeline. And Reagan, in an act that stunned his own advisors, refused. He walked away. He would not give up his dream, his shield. This was the true confrontation. It was a political, intellectual, and economic surrender, broadcast to the world, even if the world didn't understand the subtext. Gorbachev had shown his hand. He had publicly admitted that the Soviet Union could not survive a new arms race in space. The Phantom had won. But the Soviet military machine, a beast that ran on its own inertia, could not simply stop. It had to build a futile response. The marshals, who still believed in steel and missiles, not in economic theories, demanded their countermeasures. The result was a frantic, desperate, and ultimately pathetic series of wonder weapons designed to defeat a shield that didn't even exist. The most famous was the development of the Polyus, or Skiff-DM space weapon. If the Americans were building a battle station, the Soviets would build one first. On May 15, 1987, the USSR launched its new heavy-lift rocket, Energia, the most powerful launch vehicle in the world. Its payload was a secret. The payload was Polyus. It was an 80-ton, black-painted orbital monstrosity. It was a parody of a Star Wars weapon. It carried a 1-megawatt carbon dioxide laser and a turret of space-to-space missiles. It was quite literally a Soviet Death Star. It was designed to shoot down American SDI satellites, to blind their sensors, to fight a war in orbit that had not yet begun. The launch was a showcase. Gorbachev himself was at Baikonur. The Energia rocket, a masterpiece of Soviet engineering, performed flawlessly, blazing a trail into the sky. Then, the final, tragic comic failure. The Polyus module separated. It was programmed to perform a 180-degree pitch-around maneuver to orient its engines to push into a stable orbit. But due to a simple software flaw, the module didn't stop. It rotated a full 360 degrees. It ignited its engines while facing the wrong direction. Instead of ascending into orbit, the 80-ton, multi-billion-ruble Star Wars killer, the pride of the Soviet response, hurled itself back toward Earth, burning up in a silent, incandescent streak over the South Pacific. It was a perfect metaphor. Their response to the American dream was a monstrous, over-budget, and overly complex machine that, in the end, simply failed, destroying itself through its own flawed logic. They had built a counter to a fantasy, and their counter had proven to be a failure. The mystery was solved. The truth was out. And the truth was that the Soviet Union was, in fact, bankrupt militarily, scientifically, and economically. The final verdict on the Strategic Defense Initiative is not found in a battlefield assessment. It's found in an autopsy report. The autopsy of a dead empire. The killer statistic of this conflict wasn't measured in megatons or missile intercepts. It was measured in money, and the final tally is staggering. While the United States spent approximately $30 billion on SDI research over its main decade, a vast sum, the Soviet Union, in its desperate, panicked response, spent a figure that is conservatively estimated to be in the hundreds of billions of rubles. It was a blank check, drawn on an account that was already empty. This is the macro theme, the grand systemic failure. The Soviet economy was a brittle, rusting machine. It was built in the 1930s for one purpose: to churn out tanks, steel, and concrete. It was a centralized, top-down system designed for imitation, not innovation. When America built the atomic bomb, the Soviets stole the plans and built one too. When America built a supersonic jet, the Soviets copied the design and built their one. But SDI broke the model. It was a threat they could not copy, and a problem they could not solve with their existing industrial base. It wasn't a tank. It was a concept. It was a challenge in the one area where the West's dominance was absolute: high-speed distributed computing and software. The USSR could build the world's biggest rocket, Energia, but it could not build the millions of lines of flawless code needed to run a brilliant Pebbles network. It could forge massive lasers, but it couldn't mass-produce the microchips to aim them. In their frantic attempt to respond, they diverted their best scientists, their most precious resources, and their last remaining hard currency away from their rotting civilian economy. The poison pill, the one the cynical analysts had warned about, had been swallowed. The Soviet Union was spending itself to death, chasing a ghost conjured by a Hollywood actor. While the Soviet military-industrial complex was building its monstrous, self-destructing Polya space laser, the Soviet state itself was collapsing from within. The store shelves were empty. The bread lines grew longer. The deep systemic rot that had been papered over by the threat of nuclear parity was finally exposed, precisely because that parity was now in question. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it wasn't pushed over by a tank. It was chipped away by a populace that had lost all faith in a system that could aim ICBMs at Washington, but could not provide a loaf of bread in Moscow. The Star Wars program, by accelerating this economic collapse, was the final decisive blow. The legacy of the Strategic Defense Initiative is one of the strangest and most profound of the entire Cold War. It is the story of a weapon that won a war without ever being built. Not a single SDI battle station was ever deployed. Not one Soviet missile was ever intercepted. The grand shield of lasers and particle beams remains to this day the domain of science fiction. The program was, by all technical measures, a failure. It did not achieve its stated goal. And yet, it was perhaps the single most effective strategic maneuver of the 20th century. It was a weapon made of imagination. It was a mystery that exploited the deepest fears and the most crippling weaknesses of its adversary. The Soviets were masters of the material world of steel, of concrete, of territory. They were utterly defeated by an idea. They were baffled by the sheer scale of the American dream, and in their attempt to quantify it, to respond to it, and to defeat it, they destroyed themselves. The Cold War was not in the end won by the side with the most missiles. It was won by the side that understood the future. The Soviets looked at SDI and saw a terrifying futuristic weapon. They failed to see the real weapon was the vibrant, innovative, and impossible, rich, and terrifyingly creative economic system that could dare to propose such a thing in the first place. The year is 1979. The location is a windowless concrete bunker deep within the Sevastopol naval base, the fortified heart of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. The air is thick with cigarette smoke, the acrid smell of ozone from hot electronics, and the palpable tension of men who hold the fate of an empire in their hands. This is the central command for a high-stakes wargame. But it is no ordinary exercise. On a massive glowing map screen, dozens of light symbols represent the full, terrifying power of the Soviet Navy. Squadrons of Tu-22M backfire bombers, their icons showing full payloads. Kirov-class battlecruisers, the pride of the fleet. Oscar-class submarines, silent hunters lurking in the digital depths. For 2 days, the exercise has been a resounding success. The objective, the complete annihilation of an American carrier battle group, the ultimate symbol of Western naval power. The Soviet strategy is brutal, elegant, and, in their calculations, unstoppable. It is not a duel. It is an execution. They call it time saturation asterisk. From the bombers, the cruisers, and the submarines, a single coordinated pulse of digital fire erupts. On the screen, over 100 red icons converge on the American fleet, a swarm of P-500 Basalt and P-700 Granite anti-ship missiles. Each one is a heavyweight killer, supersonic, armored, and intelligent. Some fly high, spotting targets. Others skim the waves, invisible to radar. They communicate with each other, a wolf pack of steel. The Soviet admirals watch with grim satisfaction. They know the American Phalanx CIWS system can, at best, stop 4 or 5 missiles. Their standard missiles can maybe stop a dozen more. But this is 100. The math is simple. The math is Soviet. At least 50 missiles will get through. The American carrier will die. The battle group will be annihilated. This is the cornerstone of the entire Soviet naval doctrine, perfected by the legendary Admiral Sergei Gorshkov. They cannot outbuild the Americans in carriers, so they have perfected the art of killing them. A senior captain, his face pale in the screen's green glow, inputs the final command. The simulation's algorithm, loaded with the most recent intelligence from their spies in the West, begins to run the terminal phase. And then, the impossible happens. The American carrier group, which had been passive, suddenly erupts in a storm of light. But it's not the light of explosions, it's the light of interception. On the screen, the red icons of the Soviet swarm begin to vanish. Not 1 or 2, not a dozen. They are erased in clusters. 10, then 30, then 60. The wolf pack is systemically, electronically, and clinically dismembered. A stunned silence falls over the room. The admirals lean forward, their minds refusing to process the data. "Restart the sequence," one vice admiral commands, his voice a low growl. The technicians reset the parameters. The swarm is launched again. The same result. 90 seconds of simulation time. 100 missiles launched, 0 hits. The carrier symbol sails on, untouched, a ghost of American invincibility. "The intelligence file?" the vice admiral demands. "What new variable was added?" A young intelligence officer, trembling, steps forward. "Comrade Admiral, GRU reports a new American radar designation. We know very little. It is just a code name. We fed its hypothetical parameters into the system as variable A. Then the variable is wrong?" The Admiral snaps, slamming his hand on the console. "The algorithm is flawed. It is fantasy. No system can track 100 targets. No system can guide that many interceptors. It is not physically possible." He calls it fantasy. But for the first time, in this secret room, the men who command the Red Fleet feel a cold, unfamiliar sensation. Doubt. A seed of sheer, unadulterated terror. Because if the simulation is right, if this variable A is real, then everything they know about naval warfare is wrong. Their entire fleet, the bombers, the cruisers, the submarines, the billions of rubles spent, is obsolete. The hunt for the answer to this impossible riddle had just begun. This is the reality of the Cold War. It wasn't just a standoff. It was a furious, hidden battle of innovation. The mysteries were real, and the stakes were the survival of the world. Here on Cold War Impact, we peel back the layers of these technological battles that define the modern age. If you want to understand why the world is the way it is today, you need to understand the secrets of this conflict. Subscribe to the channel, and don't miss an episode. The initial reaction in Moscow was not panic. It was denial. The report from the Sevastopol wargame was buried, classified as a data anomaly. The official conclusion was that the simulation's programmers, likely academics with no battlefield experience, had grossly overestimated the capabilities of a hypothetical American system. The admirals went back to their work, their confidence outwardly restored. But the phantom in the machine refused to disappear. Whispers began to circulate within the Soviet Navy's technical branches and the GRU's Directorate S, the department tasked with stealing foreign military technology. The whispers were not about a new radar. They were about something fundamentally different. The first concrete and utterly baffling piece of evidence came in 1980. A KGB asset, a low-level clerk working at the RCA Corporation's Missile and Surface Radar Division in Moorestown, New Jersey, passed along a stack of internal documents. They were mostly dry engineering reports, but one detail caught the eye of the Soviet analysts. It was a photograph of a test ship, the USS Norton Sound. Mounted on its superstructure was not a radar, not as they knew it. Soviet radar philosophy was built on massive, powerful rotating dishes. Their top dome and top steer radars were colossal, mechanically swept behemoths. They were strong, and they were simple. You could see them spin, physically throwing out beams of energy. This was different. The photo showed a flat, octagonal, pale grey panel. It didn't move. It looked dead. It resembled a piece of abstract, angular armor. What was it? A new type of heat shield? A communications array? The accompanying text was even more confusing. It was filled with arcane Western terms. Phased array. Passive electronic scanning. Beam. Steering. To the Soviet engineers, steeped in the tradition of heavy, mechanical engineering, it read like science fiction. They understood phased array in theory. The concept had been around for decades. Instead of a single moving dish, you used a face made of thousands of tiny individual transmitters. By minutely shifting the timing, the phase of the energy sent to each transmitter, you could steer the resulting radar beam electronically. This meant you could move the beam from one part of the sky to another in microseconds. No moving parts, no lag, no mechanical inertia. A conventional spinning radar might update a target's position once every 10 or 15 seconds. This new system, in theory, could update it 1,000 times in that same span. It could, in essence, look everywhere at once. This was the source of the data anomaly. This was variable A. The implications of this discovery were so horrifying that they were initially dismissed. The report was sent up the chain of command, from the GRU to the Central Committee's Defense Commission. The verdict was swift and damning, but not for the Americans. It was for the Soviet analysts. "Comrades," one general declared, "you are telling us the Americans have built a radar that requires a computer brain we cannot even conceptualize, a system that requires manufacturing tolerances we cannot match. You are telling us they have invalidated our entire missile strategy with a panel?" It was easier to believe it was a bluff, a piece of American disinformation designed to scare them. But the Soviet leadership was deeply pragmatic. They believed in numbers, in mass. Their entire doctrine was built on overwhelming force. The P-700 Granite missile was a masterpiece of Soviet engineering. A 9-ton, 25-foot-long monster that could fly at Mach 2.5, carrying either a 1,600-pound conventional warhead or a 500-kiloton nuclear payload. It was, they believed, the single greatest ship killer on Earth. The idea that a single American panel could render a salvo of 50 Granites useless was not just strategically terrifying, it was personally insulting. And so, the official response was one of studied denial. The ghost from the Sevastopol simulation was compartmentalized. It was a technical curiosity, a Western boondoggle, an overly complex and unreliable piece of American fantasy. But in the secret design bureaus at Almaz, at NPO Kvant, at the Altair Naval Design Bureau, the engineers were not so sure. They were the ones who had to actually build the systems to defeat the Americans. And they saw the writing on the wall. If the Americans had truly solved the phased array puzzle, if they had married it to a high-speed computer, they had done more than build a new radar. They had built a shield, an impenetrable electronic fortress that could see in all directions at once. A fortress that could track every bomber, every missile, every fighter, and guide dozens of interceptors to their targets simultaneously. The admirals in Sevastopol had been right to be afraid. The simulation wasn't flawed. It was a prophecy. While the admirals in Moscow slept, comforted by their denial, the men in the design bureaus began to have nightmares. They weren't fighting a new American radar. They were fighting the future, and it was a future for which they had no answer. The phantom of Sevastopol did not stay buried. It began to haunt the Soviet high command, emerging not as a single coherent threat, but as a series of disturbing, disconnected fragments. The great paranoid mechanism of the Soviet state, the KGB, the GRU, and the vast bureaucracy of the military-industrial complex began to grind, turning its full attention to this American enigma. The investigation was not a coordinated effort. It was a scramble, a dozen different agencies hunting for the same ghost, all of them hoarding their data, all of them terrified of being the one to deliver the bad news. The GRU's Directorate S, the technology thieves, were the first to find tangible, terrifying clues. Their assets in Japan, monitoring the flow of commercial electronics to American military suppliers, reported something alarming. The US Navy was buying computer processing chips, specifically the new Intel 8080 and Zilog Z80 microprocessors by the ton. To the Soviet analysts, this made no sense. These were toy processors, designed for hobbyist computers or industrial controllers. The Soviet military believed in real computers. Their Elbrus mainframes were massive, power-hungry beasts that filled entire rooms, built for singular, powerful calculations like cracking codes or plotting missile trajectories. Why were the Americans buying millions of toy brains? A GRU analyst, in a report that was initially dismissed as fantasy, proposed a radical theory: distributed computing. The Americans weren't building one giant, centralized brain. They were building a network of hundreds of smaller, faster brains, linking them together, giving each one a specific, simple task. One chip to manage one radar transmitter, one chip to track one incoming target, one chip to guide one interceptor missile. They were building, he wrote, a collective intelligence, a silicon hive mind. This was a manufacturing and programming concept so far beyond the Soviet industrial base that it was again deemed unreliable. The Soviet system was built on mass and scale. The American system was being built on miniaturization and integration. It was a philosophical divide, and the Soviets were on the wrong side of it. While the GRU hunted for chips, the KGB's first chief directorate, the PGU, hunted for human intelligence. They activated assets across NATO, from shipyard workers in Pascagoula, Mississippi, to low-level attachés in Athens. The reports that came back were contradictory and only deepened the mystery. A shipyard welder in Mississippi, working on a new class of cruiser, reported seeing workers install massive, prefabricated blocks into the superstructure. He described them as dead rooms, filled with racks and racks of electronics, but with no rotating machinery. He said the ship looked unfinished, like they had forgotten to install the radars. An officer in the Greek Navy, observing joint NATO exercises, filed a report that was flagged by his KGB handler. He described an American ship, the USS Ticonderoga, sitting in the middle of a complex live-fire drill. The American ship, he noted with confusion, did not seem to be participating. Its main radars were not spinning. It just sat there. And then, the sky filled with missiles, drones, rockets and torpedoes, all fired from different ships and planes. The Greek officer watched, waiting for the American ship to defend itself. Instead, he saw the other ships in the battle group, the destroyers, the frigates, suddenly come alive. Their guns and missile launchers fired with perfect, inhuman coordination. Targets were blasted out of the sky. It was, the officer wrote, as if the dead American cruiser was a conductor and the rest of the fleet was its orchestra. It wasn't just defending itself, it was managing the entire battle space for everyone. This report sent a shockwave through Soviet naval intelligence. This wasn't just a new radar. This wasn't just a new computer. This was an entirely new doctrine. The Soviets had built their fleet on the concept of the specialist. The Slava-class cruiser was a missile carrier. The Udaloy-class destroyer was a submarine hunter. Each ship was a powerful but blunt instrument, designed for one job. The Americans, it seemed, had built a network. This realization began to build a legend, a bogeyman inside the Soviet fleet. Sailors on Soviet trawler ships, spy vessels disguised as fishing boats, would shadow American battle groups for weeks, their electronic sensors pointed at the new angular American cruisers. They would listen. And the silence is what terrified them. Soviet electronic warfare was built on noise. Their radars blasted powerful, crude pulses of energy. You could hear them, you could jam them, you could track them. The new American ships, however, were eerily quiet. They used low probability of intercept frequencies. They hopped their signals across the spectrum. Sometimes, they didn't seem to transmit at all, instead using the signals from other ships, planes, or even satellites. To the Soviet sensor operators, the American fleet had become a ghost. This led to a flurry of wrong conclusions, each one more desperate than the last. The first theory was that it was a laser. The sudden, instantaneous kill of missiles in the Sevastopol simulation led some to believe the Americans had perfected a directed energy weapon. This theory gained traction because it fit the Soviet mindset, a single, powerful superweapon. They immediately began pouring billions of rubles into their own laser defense programs, a costly and fruitless dead end. The second theory was that it was a new form of electronic jamming. They believed the Americans weren't shooting down the missiles, but blinding their guidance systems with a new, powerful form of electronic warfare. This, too, seemed logical. The Soviets knew their electronics were a generation behind. They rushed to harden their missile seekers, adding new filters and shields, but they were hardening them against a threat that didn't exist. The third and most paranoid theory was that it was a submarine. Some in the high command, particularly the old guard officers of the Brown Water Navy, simply refused to believe a surface ship could be invincible. The ghosts in the simulations, they argued, must be a new class of ultra-quiet American hunter-killer submarine, like the new Los Angeles class, operating in concert with the surface ships and spoofing the data. They argued for more anti-submarine ships, diverting resources from the real threat. All of these theories missed the point. They were looking for a thing, a new radar, a new missile, a new laser. They could not comprehend that what the Americans had built was not a thing, but a system. It was a concept, a new way of thinking about war. They were looking for a better sword, but the Americans had built an invisible shield. A shield so advanced, it could also be the sword, directing the entire fleet's fire with the speed of light. This was the bogeyman. It wasn't a monster. It was a brain that saw everything, knew everything, and could react 1,000 times faster than any human admiral. And it was now at sea, pointed directly at the heart of the Soviet Union. While the Soviets hunted ghosts in the quiet, pine-barren shielded suburbs of New Jersey, the Phantom was being born. The location was not a secret underground bunker or a remote desert test site. It was a sprawling, unassuming corporate campus in Moorestown, New Jersey, the headquarters of RCA's Missile and Surface Radar Division. It was here, far from the admirals and the politicians, that a quiet, parallel war was being fought by men in white shirts and pocket protectors. And they were losing. In the mid-1960s, American naval dominance was a given. But by the early 1970s, that dominance was on the verge of total collapse. The threat was not theoretical. It was a mathematical certainty. The threat was the Soviet saturation doctrine. The US Navy's own wargames, run on their most advanced computers, produced the same horrifying result that Sevastopol would later see, only in reverse. The American admirals knew, with chilling certainty, that their carrier battle groups were little more than high-value target practice. They called it the 3-minute war. From the moment a Soviet Bear or Badger bomber spotted a US carrier, a clock would start. Within minutes, squadrons of Tu-22M backfire bombers would be wheels up, their bellies full of AS-4 Kitchen missiles. Simultaneously, Kirov and Slava-class cruisers and the terrifying Oscar-class submarines would maneuver into firing position. Then, the swarm, 100 missiles, all screaming towards the carrier from different directions, at different altitudes. Some, like the Kitchen, came in at Mach 4, a blistering, unstoppable dive from 80,000 feet. Others, like the Granite, were sea-skimming, wave-hopping Terminators, nearly invisible to radar. The American fleet's defenses were a joke in the face of this. Their radars, the SPS-48 and SPS-49, were powerful, but they were mechanical. They were great, spinning dishes like lighthouses. They could scan the sky once every 10, maybe 15 seconds. In that blink, a Mach 4 missile could cross 20 miles. They were, in effect, blind. Worse, the entire defense system was run by humans. A radar operator in a dark room would see a blip. He would call out, "Vampire, vampire," over a headset. A weapons officer would have to manually designate the target. A different radar would have to lock on. A missile would be fired. The entire sequence, from detection to launch, could take 30 seconds. Against 100 missiles arriving in a 3-minute window, this system was not just inadequate, it was suicidal. The Navy was facing extinction. They needed a miracle. They didn't just need a new radar or a new missile. They needed to reinvent naval warfare. They needed to take the human out of the detect-to-kill loop. They needed to build a system that could see everywhere, at all times, and react at the speed of light. They needed, in essence, to build a god. The man tasked with this impossible quest was a brilliant, famously curmudgeonly, and utterly relentless Navy captain named Wayne E. Meyer. Meyer was not a typical battleship admiral. He was an engineer, a Sparky. And he saw the problem was not one of hardware, but of philosophy. "We are building ships," he argued, "but the Soviets are building systems of attack. We must build a system of defense." RCA, the company that had given America the color television, won the contract. They were tasked with building the Advanced Electronic Gunnery Integration System. The acronym, AEGIS, was a happy accident. Aegis. In Greek mythology, the impenetrable shield of the god Zeus. The name was a statement of intent, and what they built in Morristown would change the world forever. They didn't just solve the problem, they created a technological leap so vast it would take the rest of the world 3 decades to even begin to catch up. The ingenuity of Aegis was not in one single invention, it was a system of systems, a perfect, deadly fusion of 3 revolutionary concepts. First was the eye. This was the answer to the Soviets' dead panel photo. It was the AN divided by SPY-1 radar. The SPY-1 was not a radar, it was an event in physics. Instead of one spinning dish, the SPY-1 was comprised of 4 flat, octagonal faces bolted to the ship's superstructure. Each face was a phased array, a dense honeycomb of 4,096 individual solid-state transmitters. A spinning radar was a flashlight, sweeping a beam around a dark room, hoping to catch a burglar. The SPY-1 was a light bulb, instantly illuminating the entire room, in all directions, from floor to ceiling, permanently. It had no moving parts. The beam was steered electronically, its phase shifted by a computer. It could fire a beam in one direction then, in 1 microsecond, fire a beam in a completely opposite direction. It wasn't just looking for targets. It was creating a 360-degree, 200-mile radius bubble of pure energy, and any object that entered that bubble, from a high-flying bomber to a low-skimming missile to a flock of birds, was instantly acquired, catalogued, and gripped by the system. It could track a baseball, thrown from 100 miles away, and it could do this for 200 baseballs simultaneously. Second was the brain. This was the answer to the GRU's toy processor mystery. The SPY-1's eye was generating an ocean of data so vast it would have melted any single computer in the world, Soviet or American. So, RCA didn't use one computer. They used 16. This was the distributed computing the Soviets couldn't grasp. The Americans, masters of commercial miniaturization, linked dozens of smaller, faster, more reliable computers into a federated network. It was the Silicon Hive mind. One system, the command and decision, C&D, was the strategist. It took all 200 tracks from the SPY-1 and, in a nanosecond, identified them. Is it friendly? Is it a bomber? Is it a missile? Is it a threat? It would automatically prioritize the list, from most lethal to least lethal. Another system, the Weapons Control System, WCS, was the assassin. The C&D would hand off the target list, and the WCS would instantly calculate the perfect kill solution for all of them. It would decide, that backfire bomber at 80 miles, assign a standard missile, that sea-skimming granite at 10 miles, assign the phalanx cannon, that other missile at 40 miles, assign the other cruiser's missile. This was the orchestra the Greek officer had witnessed. The Aegis ship wasn't just defending itself, it was commanding the entire battle group's defenses, automatically, within human speed. Third, and most critically, was the sword. This was the detect-to-kill chain. Aegis automated the entire process. The SPY-1 sees the target. The C&D identifies it as hostile. The WCS assigns the brand new Standard Missile 2, SM-2. The missile leaps from its vertical launcher. But here was the true genius. The SM-2 didn't even need its own radar. The entire time it was in flight, the SPY-1 radar would grip it, sending it guidance updates via data link course corrections, speed adjustments. The missile was flying dark. Only in the last 2 seconds of flight would the Aegis ship paint the target with a separate high-powered illuminator radar. The missile would see the LASER dot and dive in for the kill. The Soviet missile would have no idea it was being targeted until it was already dead. This was the Phantom. This was the ghost in the machine. It was a shield, a brain, and an assassin, all wrapped in one. A system that could see everything, track everything, and kill everything, all at once. And in 1983, the first Aegis cruiser, the USS Ticonderoga, quietly put to sea. The monster the Soviets had been chasing was finally loose. The greatest leap in naval warfare since the aircraft carrier was now floating off their coast, and they were still trying to figure out if it was a laser or a submarine. The denial, the whispers, the desperate, flawed theories, they all evaporated on one single catastrophic day, the day the Phantom finally showed its face. The confrontation was not a climactic naval battle in the North Atlantic. There was no thunderous exchange of missiles between fleets. The reveal, when it came, was far more modern and far more terrifying. It arrived as a sterile, deeply classified after-action report, placed on the desk of the Chief of Soviet Naval Intelligence in Moscow. The date of the incident was July 3rd, 1988. The location, the hot, tense, and contested waters of the Persian Gulf in the Strait of Hormuz. The world knew of the incident. It was a global tragedy, a shocking headline. The American AEGIS cruiser, USS Vincennes, had shot down Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian Airbus, a 300, killing all 290 people on board. To the world, it was a horrifying, almost incomprehensible blunder. A case of trigger-happy Americans, of faulty intelligence, of the terrifying fog of war. But to the Soviet analysts who read the classified data, gleaned from their own signals intelligence, SIGINT posts in the region, and reports from their Lyra-class spy trawlers, the incident was something else entirely. It was not a blunder. It was a demonstration. It was the single most terrifying display of raw, cold, and inhuman capability they had ever witnessed. Their analysts in Moscow didn't care about the Vincennes captain's justification. They didn't care about the political fallout. They cared about the timeline. They cared about the physics. And the physics they saw laid out in the report made their blood run cold. This is what the Soviet admirals saw and why it broke them. The USS Vincennes was, at the time, engaged in a high-intensity surface battle with small, fast Iranian gunboats. Its decks were vibrating from the recoil of its own 5-inch guns. It was, by all definitions, in the chaotic heart of a close-in fight. At 10:47 a.m., in the middle of this gun battle, Iran Air Flight 655 took off from the nearby Bandar Abbas airport. The Vincennes' SPY-1 radar, the dead panel the Soviets had once dismissed, instantly acquired the aircraft as it lifted off the runway. It was one of more than 40 contacts the eye was tracking at that exact moment. The brain of AEGIS, the command and decision system, immediately catalogued the new target. It noted its position, its speed, its altitude. And, because the aircraft was ascending from an airport inside Iran and squawking a civilian transponder code, the system correctly tagged it as unknown, assumed civilian. But the human operators, stressed, in combat, and primed to expect an attack, made a different assumption. They believed it was an Iranian F-14 Tomcat, a fighter jet the Americans had sold to the Shah of Iran decades prior. They believed it was diving to attack their ship. This is where the Soviet analysts' terror began. The Vincennes operators began to challenge the unknown target over military radio. The Airbus, on a civilian frequency, did not respond. The AEGIS system, meanwhile, just continued to work. It didn't care about the fog of war. It didn't panic. As the human operators grew more frantic, the C and D system simply kept updating the target's data. Target is ascending. Target is on a commercial air corridor. Target speed is consistent with an A300. The ship's captain, relying on his panicked human reports rather than his own ship's brain, made the fatal decision. He declared the target hostile. At 10:54 a.m., just 7 minutes after the Airbus had taken off, he gave the order to fire. The WCS, the assassin, had been waiting. It had been holding a kill solution on the Airbus and on every other contact in the sky from the moment they were detected. The instant the captain gave the consent, the system acted. It didn't need to lock on. It didn't need to spin up a radar. It instantly selected 2 standard missile. 2 seconds. It instantly launched them from its vertical launch system. The Soviet analysts noted the launch time. Then they noted the target destruction time. The missiles had traveled over 10 miles. The entire sequence, from the captain's yes to the 290 deaths, was over in less than 40 seconds. The shock in Moscow was profound. It was a wave of pure, systemic horror. They finally, truly, understood. They realized that the Sevastopol war game had not been a fantasy or an anomaly. It had been a conservative estimate. They realized the blunder in the Persian Gulf was, for them, a worst-case scenario come to life. The Americans had a system so powerful, so fast and so lethal that it could accidentally wipe a civilian airliner from the sky in the middle of a separate, chaotic gun battle without even breaking a sweat. The AEGIS brain hadn't even been stressed. It had simply classified one target out of dozens and, when told to, had effortlessly executed it. The Soviet admirals realized, in that moment, what this meant for their saturation doctrine. Their entire naval strategy, the swarm of 100 missiles, was a child's fantasy. If AEGIs could track an A-300 in a cluttered air corridor, it could track a P-700 Granite in the open ocean. If it could guide 2 missiles to a kill in seconds, while also fighting a gun battle, it could guide 80 missiles to a kill during a full-scale swarm. The Phantom was real. The variable A from the simulation was not just a radar or a computer or a missile, it was a fortress. A single American ship, they now knew, could sit off the coast of Murmansk and by itself shoot down every single plane, missile and bomber the Red Banner Northern Fleet sent at it. And the Americans weren't building one. They were building 20, then 50. The response in Moscow was one of sheer, unadulterated panic. The veil of denial was ripped away, replaced by the horrifying naked truth. They were no longer in a competition. They were in a slaughter. Their countermeasures, which had once seemed so logical, now looked pathetic. Their first futile response was simply mass. If 100 missiles will not work, the old guard admirals argued, then we will build a ship that fires 20 Granite missiles at once. We will build the Slava-class cruiser. This was the Slava, an AEGIS killer, a missile battleship. It was a desperate, brutish, and utterly Soviet solution. And it was completely useless. The Aegis system on a USS Ticonderoga would see the Slava from 250 miles away. The Slava, a massive, non-stealthy block of steel, lit up on radar like a burning cathedral. The Slava's own Granite missiles had a range of only 190 miles at best. It was a math problem a child could solve. The Slava AEGS killer would itself be killed by American Harpoon or Tomahawk missiles, fired from the Ticonderoga from 100 miles outside the Slava's own firing range. The Aegis killer would never even get to fire its weapons. It was a suicide ship. Their second, more desperate, response was speed and stealth. They poured their last remaining rubles into designing new missiles. Missiles that flew faster, at Mach 5. Missiles that were stealthy, made of new materials. Missiles that could weave and pop up at the last second. It didn't matter. They were trying to outsmart a computer. They were trying to outfly the speed of light. The SPY-1 radar didn't care if the missile was stealthy. It was still a physical object, and the bubble of energy AEGs created would find it. The brain didn't care if the missile weaved. The WCS could calculate a new firing solution 1,000 times a second. The faster the Soviets built the sword, the faster the Americans perfected the shield. The Soviet admirals were trapped. They were horrified. They had spent 30 years and the entire wealth of their nation building a navy of saturation attackers. And in one day in the Persian Gulf, they learned, in the most tragic way possible, that their entire fleet was obsolete. They were kings of a type of warfare that no longer existed. The true impact of the AEGIS system is not measured in the number of missiles it shot down in combat. It is measured in the number of missiles never fired. It is measured in the cold, deafening silence of the Soviet High Command, as they came to a collective, soul-crushing realization: the Cold War at sea was over, and they had lost. The horrifying truth, laid bare by the Vincennes incident, was that their entire naval strategy, the product of 30 years of national effort and hundreds of billions of rubles, was a complete and total failure. The saturation swarm was a fantasy. Their Aegis killer ships were floating coffins. Their entire fleet, from the backfire bombers in the sky to the Oscar submarines in the deep, had been rendered obsolete, not by a bigger missile or a thicker hull, but by a thought. The final, brutal verdict, the killer statistic, was not one of combat, but of production. As the Soviet economy began to crack and groan under the strain of this new, impossible arms race, the Americans did not just build one AEGIS shield, they industrialized it. First came the 27 ships of the Ticonderoga class. Each one by itself was capable of defending an entire carrier battle group from a full-scale Soviet swarm. Then, as the Soviet Union itself began to falter, the US Navy unveiled its masterstroke, the Arleigh Burke class destroyer. This was the final nail in the coffin. The Arleigh Burke was smaller, cheaper, and more advanced than the Ticonderoga. It was a mass production model of the AEGIS system. The Americans didn't just have 27 of these ships. They began building 75 of them. The Soviet Union, in its entire desperate response, had managed to build only 3 of its lumbering, flawed Slava-class Aegis killers. The final tally: over 100 American Aegis, capable ships, versus 0 effective Soviet counters. This was not a failure of tactics, it was a failure of philosophy. It was the great, systemic collapse of the Soviet model, played out in steel and silicon. The Soviets were masters of imitation and scale. They could see an American B-52 bomber and, through sheer brute force engineering and espionage, create their own Tu-95. They could see a Minuteman missile and build their own SS-18. They were brilliant at solving known problems. But Aegis was not a problem they could solve. It was a concept. It was the product of a different system of thinking. The Soviet Union, with its top-down, centralized, military-first economy, built muscle. It built the P-700 Granite, the largest, fastest anti-ship missile in the world. It built the Kirov-class battlecruiser, the largest warship in the world that wasn't a carrier. It was an empire of hardware, but Aegis was software. It was a brain, built by an American system that was decentralized, chaotic, and driven by commercial innovation. The I of Aegis came from RCA, a company that sold televisions. The brain of Aegis was built from microprocessors designed by Intel and Zilog, companies that, just a few years later, would be selling toy computers to high school students. The Soviets were trying to solve a 21st century problem of information warfare with a 20th century solution of more firepower. They were trying to defeat a hive mind of microprocessors with a bigger warhead. They were building a better sword, while the Americans had perfected an invisible, impenetrable shield. This was the true legacy of the Aegis system. It was not just a weapon, it was a verdict on an entire way of life. It proved that an open, innovative and commercially driven society could outthink and outbuild a closed, secretive and centralized one. The grand, nuclear-powered battlecruisers of the Red Banner Northern Fleet ships like the Kirov and the Frunze were not defeated in battle. They were simply rendered irrelevant. They sailed the seas as the most powerful, magnificent and expensive museums in naval history, dinosaurs of a bygone age, their granite missiles silent in their tubes. They were built for a war that had already been lost, on a simulation screen, in a windowless bunker in Sevastopol in 1979. The ghost in that machine was real. It was not a data anomaly. It was a prophecy. It was the sound of the American century, a century defined not just by industrial might, but by the mastery of information itself. The war for the seas was not won by the nation with the most steel. It was won by the nation that could think the fastest.